Close your eyes. Imagine a sky. Not the sky you see through windows and between buildings. A sky with nothing between you and the horizon in any direction. A vast, unbroken dome of stars, impossibly bright, impossibly numerous. The kind of sky that you can only see when there is no city for 100 miles in any direction. This is the steppe, the great Eurasian grassland that stretches from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east. 4,000 miles of open ground, wind-bent grass and sky, the homeland of the horse peoples, the place where, for thousands of years, nomadic tribes lived and fought and moved with the seasons, following the grass, following the herds, worshipping the eternal blue sky above them. In the early 13th century, a man rose from this steppe who would change the world more dramatically and more violently than almost any person in human history. Genghis Khan. He built the largest contiguous land empire in history, an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Central Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, an empire so vast that it is almost impossible to hold in the imagination. And then he died. And the people he left behind, his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, the men who inherited the greatest empire the world had ever seen, tore it apart. Not in a single dramatic collapse, not in one great battle lost or one catastrophic mistake, but slowly across a century and a half, through a combination of civil war and fratricidal conflict, through plague and religious conversion, through the simple impossibility of governing something so enormous, through the gradual absorption of conquerors into the cultures they had conquered. Tonight we follow that slow and magnificent unraveling. From the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, through the extraordinary careers of his sons and grandsons, through the Black Death and the civil wars and the final fragmentation, all the way to the moment when the last echo of the greatest empire in history fell silent. It is a story of extraordinary people in impossible circumstances, of men and women who inherited the world and didn't know what to do with it. So settle in, let the steppe wind come, let the stars burn overhead, and let history carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. The man who built it all. To understand how the Mongol Empire fell, you first need to understand what Genghis Khan built and how he built it. He was born around 1162 in the grasslands of eastern Mongolia with the name Temujin. His childhood was brutal even by the brutal standards of the steppe. His father was poisoned by enemies when Temujin was 9 years old. His clan abandoned his family to fend for themselves, and he spent years in desperate poverty, living on roots and small game. He was enslaved, he escaped. And then, with a combination of military genius, political brilliance, personal charisma, and a ruthlessness that was breathtaking even in an era when ruthlessness was the common currency of power, he rose. He built alliances, he defeated rivals, he united the warring Mongol tribes, a thing that had never been done before under a single authority. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai on the banks of the Onon River, the united Mongol tribes proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What followed was the most extraordinary military expansion in history. The Mongol army was built on principles that were genuinely revolutionary. Promotion was based on merit, not birth. Conquered peoples were incorporated into the army rather than simply enslaved. Intelligence gathering before campaigns was meticulous. Logistics were planned with a care that most ancient armies never bothered with. And the Mongols moved faster than any army the ancient or medieval world had ever seen. They lived on their horses. They carried their supplies with them. They could cover ground in days that would take conventional armies weeks. In 21 years of campaigning, they destroyed the Jin dynasty of northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire of Central Asia, the kingdoms of Persia and Afghanistan, the principalities of Russia, and penetrated deep into Poland and Hungary. Genghis Khan died in 1227 of injuries sustained in a fall from a horse, though other causes have been suggested across the centuries. He was perhaps 65 years old. He had conquered more of the earth than any human being before him. And he left behind a problem that would eventually destroy everything he had built. The problem of who came next. Part 2. The Seeds of Division. Genghis Khan understood, at least partially, the problem of succession. He had 4 sons by his principal wife Bort, Jochai, Chagatai, Ojdai and Tolui, and already before his death the fault lines between them were visible. Jochai was the eldest and the most problematic. The problem was one of timing and of doubt. Bort had been captured by a rival tribe early in her marriage to Temujin and held for some months before being rescued. Jochai was born shortly after her return, too shortly, in the minds of many, for his paternity to be certain. Temujin acknowledged Jochai as his son, but the whisper of illegitimacy followed Jochai throughout his life, and his brothers, particularly Chagatai, who was sharp-tongued and contemptuous, never let him forget it. The 2 men reportedly came to blows over the question on at least one occasion, forcing Genghis Khan himself to intervene. It would have been natural for the eldest son to inherit, but the question of Jochai's paternity made it impossible. Genghis Khan solved the problem by choosing his 3rd son, Ojdai, a jovial, generous, politically astute man whom even his brothers found it difficult to resent, as his successor to the position of Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the unified empire. The lands of the empire were divided among all 4 sons. Jochai received the westernmost territories, the vast steppe lands from the Ural Mountains westward, as far as the hooves of Mongol horses had trodden. He died before his father, possibly murdered, and his lands passed to his own sons. Chagatai received the Central Asian heartlands, the region of Transoxiana and the steppes north of it. He was known primarily for his fierce enforcement of Mongol traditional law and his equally fierce drinking. Ojdai received the Mongolian heartland and the overall title of Great Khan. Tolui, the youngest, received the traditional Mongol homeland, the ancestral territories in Mongolia itself, and became the caretaker of the main Mongol army, as was customary for the youngest son in Mongol tradition. It was a reasonable arrangement, given the impossibility of the problem, and it held together for a generation. But the seeds of conflict were planted in its very structure. 4 powerful men, each with his own territory and his own ambitions, each descended from the same father, each with a claim, however qualified, to ultimate authority. What happens when those claims come into conflict? The history of the next 150 years is the answer. Part 3. Ojdai, the drinker who nearly conquered Europe. Ojdai Khan was, by most accounts, a genuinely likable man. He was generous to a fault, capable of giving away enormous amounts of wealth on impulse, moved by the distress of the poor in ways that his father had perhaps not been. He was sociable, warm, fond of company and of celebration. He was also, critically, a political genius who understood how to manage the competing ambitions of the Mongol princes better than almost anyone else could have. And he was a spectacular alcoholic. This is not a minor biographical detail, it shaped the history of the world. Ojdai Khan drank himself to death. He knew he was doing it. He reportedly tried to stop, or at least his advisors tried to get him to stop, and he would agree to limits and then immediately exceed them. His brother Tolui reportedly drank a ritual cup of poison on his behalf in a shamanistic ceremony intended to transfer the illness from Ojdai to himself, and died. Whether this was suicide, murder, or genuine shamanistic ritual, the sources do not agree. But while Ojdai was alive, the empire continued to expand. The western campaigns under his general Batu, Jochai's son, and the brilliant military strategist Subutai swept through Russia in 1237 and 1238 with devastating speed, destroying the Russian principalities one by one in the depths of winter when their rivers were frozen solid enough for Mongol horses to cross. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, Ryazan, Kiev, the greatest city in Russia, burned to the ground, its population massacred or enslaved. Then Poland and Hungary in 1241, the Polish and Hungarian armies destroyed, the Mongols reaching the Adriatic coast. Western Europe lay open. And then Ojdai died. In December 1241, word reached the Mongol armies in Hungary that the Great Khan was dead. By Mongol law and tradition, all the princes of the blood were required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would choose the next Great Khan. The armies turned around. They never came back. Western Europe does not know how close it came. The Mongol armies that had destroyed every force they faced, that had burned Russian cities to ash, that had ridden across the frozen rivers of Poland in the depths of winter, those armies stopped at the Adriatic because a man in Mongolia had drunk himself to death. It is one of the great what-ifs of history. Part 4: The Regency and the Women. When a great Khan died, the business of the empire did not stop. Someone had to govern while the princes assembled and debated and chose the next ruler. The Mongols had a solution that was, for the medieval world, quite remarkable. The senior wife of the deceased Khan served as regent. This was not a minor or ceremonial role. The regent governed the entire empire, made decisions, issued orders, managed the vast bureaucracy that Genghis Khan and Ojdai had built. She had real power, and the Mongol system expected her to exercise it. Ojdai's widow, Torjin Khatun, served as regent for 5 years, from 1241 to 1246. She was a politically skilled and formidable woman who used the regency to position her own son, Gayuk, for the succession. She replaced officials she didn't trust with people loyal to her. She cultivated allies. She managed the competing princes with a skill that kept the empire functioning through the difficult interregnum. When the Kurultai finally met in 1246, Gayuk was elected Great Khan, as his mother had planned. He was not a good choice. Gayuk was arrogant, ill-tempered, and in poor health, probably seriously ill with the same alcoholism that had killed his father. He harbored a deep personal hatred of Batu, the ruler of the Western Khanate, dating back to a confrontation during the Western campaigns in which the two men had come to blows at a banquet. He reigned for 18 months before dying in 1248, possibly en route to confront Batu in the west. Another regency, another interregnum, another woman managing the impossible task of holding the empire together while the princes assembled and argued. And this time the succession went to a different branch of the family entirely. Part 5: The Toluids take over. The election of Mong Khan in 1251 represented a fundamental shift in the internal politics of the Mongol Empire. Mong was the son of Tolui, the youngest of Genghis Khan's 4 sons, and his election transferred supreme power from the Ojdai line, which had held it since Genghis Khan's death, to the Toluid line. This was not a peaceful transition. Mong came to power with the support of Batu, the powerful ruler of the Golden Horde in the west, and immediately moved to consolidate his position by purging the Ojdai and Chagatai princes who had opposed his election. Investigations were launched. Accusations of treason were made. Princes and officials were executed. The unity of the Mongol ruling family, already strained, cracked further. But Mong himself was a capable ruler, perhaps the most capable Great Khan after Genghis Khan himself. He reformed the imperial administration. He brought a degree of order to the financial chaos that had accumulated during the years of regency. He launched new campaigns of conquest against the Song dynasty in southern China and into the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East under his brother Hulegu. For a decade, it seemed like the empire might hold together. And then, in 1259, Mong died on campaign in China of dysentery. His death triggered the civil war that would end any real hope of Mongol unity forever. Part 6: The Brothers' War. Mong left 2 brothers who both believed they should be the next Great Khan. Kublai, who had been governing the Chinese territories, and Arik Bok, who had stayed in the Mongolian homeland. Both called Kurultais, both were elected by their respective supporters, both refused to recognize the other. For 4 years, from 1260 to 1264, the 2 brothers fought a civil war for control of the empire. It was not the clean, decisive kind of war that Genghis Khan had fought. It was a war of attrition, of economics as much as battles, of supply lines and starvation and the slow grinding down of resources. Kublai controlled China, the most productive, most wealthy part of the empire. He had access to enormous agricultural surplus, to sophisticated administrative machinery, to the revenues of the most populous region on earth. Arik Bok controlled Mongolia, the ancestral heartland, the horses, the symbolic center of Mongol identity. In the end, wealth won. Kublai's ability to feed his army and starve his brothers proved decisive. In 1264, Arakbok surrendered. He died 2 years later, possibly poisoned. Kublai Khan was now the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. But the civil war had done something that could not be undone. The other Khanates, the Golden Horde in the west, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the newly forming Ilkhanate in Persia under Hulagu, had watched the brothers tear each other apart and had drawn their own conclusions. They were sovereign rulers in their own territories. They would give nominal acknowledgement to whoever won the civil war, but their loyalty was to themselves. The unified empire was over. What remained was a family of related but increasingly independent states, connected by bloodline and by the memory of what their ancestor had built, but no longer truly united. Part 7: Kublai and China. Kublai Khan is one of the most fascinating figures of the medieval world. He was, in many ways, the most successful of Genghis Khan's successors, and also the one who most completely abandoned the Mongol identity that his grandfather had embodied. He moved his capital from Karakoram in Mongolia to Khanbalik, the city we now call Beijing. He surrounded himself with Chinese administrators, Chinese scholars, Chinese artists. He dressed in Chinese imperial robes. He commissioned Chinese-style palaces and temples. He ruled increasingly as a Chinese emperor rather than as a Mongol Khan. He completed the conquest of southern China, defeating the Song dynasty in 1279 after decades of grueling campaign. He ruled the largest empire in Chinese history. He was also genuinely curious about the world beyond his borders. Marco Polo arrived at his court in 1275 and spent 17 years in his service, returning to Venice with accounts of a civilization so sophisticated and so wealthy that his contemporaries largely refused to believe him. The Venetian merchant who had seen Kublai Khan's China would end his life dismissed as a fantasist. But Kublai's reign also contained the seeds of the dynasty's eventual destruction. He launched military campaigns that failed disastrously. 2 invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 were both destroyed by storms that the Japanese called kamikaze, the divine winds. Thousands of Mongol soldiers drowned, the fleets were wrecked. Japan was never conquered. Invasions of Vietnam and Java also failed, at enormous cost. The Chinese population that Kublai ruled, vastly more numerous than the Mongols who governed them, seethed under foreign rule. The Yuan dynasty imposed on them was never entirely accepted. Rebellion was a constant feature of the reign. And the Mongol ruling class transplanted into China began to go native. They intermarried with the Chinese. They adopted Chinese customs. They became, within a generation or two, something that was neither truly Mongol nor truly Chinese. The conquerors were being absorbed by the conquered. This is one of the great patterns of history. The warrior people who conquers a sophisticated civilization often finds, within a few generations, that it is the civilization that has done the real conquering. Part 8: The Golden Horde. In the West, the story was different. The Golden Horde, the Khanate established by Batu, Jochai's son, over the Russian steppe and the territories of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, was in many ways the most enduring of the Mongol successor states. It dominated Russia for over 2 centuries, the period Russians call the Mongol yoke, a time of tribute payments and political submission that shaped Russian history and Russian psychology in ways that historians still debate. The Golden Horde was further from China, further from the heart of Mongol power, and more isolated from the cultural absorption that transformed Kublai's court, but it was not immune to change. The most significant transformation was religious. Under Khan Ozbeg, who ruled from 1313 to 1341, the Golden Horde converted to Islam. This was not a minor administrative decision. It was a fundamental transformation of the Khanate's identity, from a shamanistic Mongol state to an Islamic sultanate that happened to be governed by descendants of Genghis Khan. The conversion had complex consequences. It strengthened the Golden Horde's connections with the Islamic world, with Egypt, with the other Muslim states of the Middle East, but it also widened the gap between the Golden Horde and the Yuan dynasty in China, which had no particular interest in Islam. The family that had conquered the world was now divided not just by distance and by politics but by faith. Part 9, the Ilkhanate and the Islamic world. In Persia, Hulagu, another of Tolui's sons, Kublai's brother, had established the Ilkhanate after one of the most dramatic campaigns in Mongol history. In 1258, Hulagu's forces sacked Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, the institution that had governed the Islamic world for 500 years, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad's political authority, the center of Islamic civilization, was destroyed in a week. The last Abbasid caliph, al-Mustasim, was executed. Contemporary accounts describe him being rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, the Mongols, who believed that royal blood was sacred and could not be spilled on the ground, devised this method of execution for rulers they wished to kill without the blood taboo violation. The sack of Baghdad was, by any measure, one of the great catastrophes of Islamic civilization. The libraries of centuries were burned, scholars were killed, the irrigation systems that had made Mesopotamia fertile for thousands of years were destroyed, and some of them never recovered. The Mongols swept on into Syria. It seemed like nothing could stop them. And then they were stopped. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, fought in what is now Israel, a Mamluk army from Egypt defeated a Mongol force in the first significant Mongol military defeat. The Mamluks were themselves a warrior people, former slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt, and who had the discipline and the tactical intelligence to fight the Mongols on something approaching equal terms. They had also, crucially, not been reduced to the state of stunned paralysis that most peoples experienced in the face of the Mongol assault. Ain Jalut did not destroy the Mongol armies in the Middle East, but it stopped their advance. The Ilkhanate settled into Persia and Iraq, governing a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim, and like the Golden Horde in the West, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam within a few generations. By the early 14th century, the Ilkhan Ghazan Khan had converted and declared Islam the state religion. The descendants of the man who had destroyed the Islamic Caliphate were now Muslim rulers. History has a dark sense of humor. Part 10, the Chagatai Khanate and the Heart of Asia. The Chagatai Khanate, occupying the Central Asian territories of modern Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and parts of China, was in many ways the most troubled of the four successor states. It occupied a region that was neither as wealthy as China nor as well connected as the Western Khanates. It had no great agricultural surplus, no sophisticated urban civilization to absorb and be absorbed by. It was a landlocked territory of steppes and mountains, difficult to govern, difficult to tax, difficult to hold together. The Chagatai Khanate became the most fractious of the successor states, a place of constant civil war, of khans overthrown and replaced with dizzying frequency, of non-Jenghisid warlords setting up puppet khans to legitimize their own power. It was also the birthplace of Timur, the man called Tamerlane in the West, who would eventually rise from this chaos to build his own brief empire on the ruins of the Mongol world. But Timur, for all his connections to Mongol tradition, he married a Jenghisid princess to legitimize his rule, was not himself a descendant of Genghis Khan. He was the end point of the Mongol story rather than a continuation of it. Part 11, the Black Deaths. In the middle of the 14th century, something happened that neither the Mongols nor anyone else could fight. The Black Death. The bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, swept across Eurasia in the 1340s and 1350s in the most devastating pandemic in human history. Between a third and a half of the population of Europe died. The death toll in the Islamic world and in Asia was comparable. The plague did not respect the distinction between conqueror and conquered, between Mongol and Chinese, between Muslim and Christian. And the Mongol Empire was, inadvertently, one of the mechanisms of its spread. The Pax Mongolica, the peace that Mongol rule had imposed across Eurasia, the security of the Silk Road trade routes, the ease of movement across the vast territories of the empire, had been one of the great achievements of Mongol governance. Trade flowed freely. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers moved across the continent with unprecedented ease. That ease of movement was also the ease with which plague moved. The disease spread along the Silk Road trade routes, from Central Asia into China, from Central Asia into the Middle East, through Mongol territory into the Black Sea ports, and from there by ship into the Mediterranean. The Mongol rulers of the various khanates died of it like everyone else. Populations that had been depleted by the Mongol conquests of a century earlier were further reduced. The economic basis of the khanates, dependent on taxing a productive agricultural population, was devastated. The Black Death did not destroy the Mongol successor states, but it accelerated their decline, stripped them of resources, and reduced the populations they governed to a fraction of what they had been. A world that had been remade by Mongol conquest was remade again by plague. Part 12. The Yuan Falls. The first of the great khanates to fall was the Yuan dynasty in China. It fell in 1368 to a rebellion led by a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, the son of a poor peasant farmer who had lost most of his family to plague and famine, who had spent years as a wandering Buddhist monk, and who had risen through the ranks of a peasant rebellion to become one of the most capable military commanders in Chinese history. He founded the Ming dynasty. He drove the Mongols out of China entirely. He became the Hongwu Emperor, the first emperor of what would prove to be one of the most enduring dynasties in Chinese history. The Yuan Mongols retreated to the steppe, back to the Mongolian homeland. There they established what historians call the Northern Yuan, a continuation of Mongol rule, but over only Mongolia, not China. They had held China for less than a century. The absorption had gone too far. The Mongol rulers of China had become too Chinese to maintain the military ferocity that had created their empire, and not Chinese enough to command the loyalty of a population that had never accepted them. Zhu Yuanzhang's rebel armies drove them north, and the greatest of the khanates ceased to exist. Part 13. The Golden Horde fragments. The Golden Horde lasted longer than the Yuan, but its end, when it came, was more chaotic. Through the late 14th century, the Golden Horde was weakened by internal civil wars, by the devastating raids of Timur, who invaded from the south and dealt the Golden Horde a blow from which it never fully recovered, and by the growing strength of the Russian principalities that had paid tribute to the Mongols for over a century. Timur's campaigns against the Golden Horde in the 1390s were particularly devastating. He destroyed the great trading cities of the steppe, Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital, and broke the commercial networks that had sustained the Khanate's wealth. The Golden Horde began to fragment into smaller successor states: the Khanate of Crimea, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Great Horde, which claimed the title of the original Golden Horde but controlled only a fraction of its territory. The Russian principalities, gradually consolidating under the leadership of Moscow, began to push back. In 1480, Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute to the Great Horde. The Mongol Khan marched his army to the Ugra River, facing Ivan's forces across the water. Neither side attacked. After a long standoff, the Mongol army turned and left. No battle, no dramatic final confrontation, just a withdrawal. The Mongol yoke over Russia was over. The successor Khanates continued for another century or more. The Khanate of Crimea survived until 1783, when Catherine the Great of Russia finally annexed it. The last descendant of Genghis Khan to rule a country did so in the 19th century. But the empire was long gone. Part 14. The Ilkhanate dissolves. The Ilkhanate of Persia, the last of the four great Khanates to be established, dissolved in the 1330s and 1340s in a succession crisis of spectacular confusion. After the death of Abu Said Bahadur in 1335, the last Ilkhan with a clear claim to the throne, the Khanate fell into chaos. Rival claimants were set up and torn down by various factions of Mongol nobles and local Persian lords. Khans reigned for months, sometimes for weeks, before being killed or deposed. By the 1350s, the Ilkhanate had effectively ceased to exist as a unified state. Its territories were divided among local dynasties, some Mongol in origin, some Persian, some of mixed heritage. The descendants of Hulagu, the man who had destroyed Baghdad and seemed on the verge of conquering the entire Islamic world, faded into history. The Islamic world they had shattered rebuilt itself. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt became the dominant power of the Middle East. Persian culture, which had been damaged but not destroyed by the Mongol conquest, flowered again in the post-Mongol period in ways that produced some of the greatest art and literature of the medieval Islamic world. The conquest that had seemed like the end of a civilization proved to be, eventually, a pause. Part 15. Why did it fall? The fall of the Mongol Empire is one of the great questions of world history, and the answers are multiple and interconnected. The first reason is the one that was visible from the very beginning. A succession. Genghis Khan never solved the problem of how power would be transferred when he died. The Kurultai system, the great assembly that elected Khans, required consensus among princes who had competing interests. Every succession was a potential civil war. Most of them were actual civil wars of varying intensity and duration. The empire was too large for this system to work. By the time messengers had traveled from one end of it to the other, months had passed. The world had changed. The assembled princes were deciding on the basis of information that was already outdated. The second reason is size. The Mongol Empire was simply too large to be governed from a single center. Different regions required different administrative approaches, different legal systems, different economic policies. The attempt to impose a single Mongolian framework on Chinese, Persian, Russian, and Central Asian populations that had nothing in common except the fact of Mongol conquest was always going to struggle. The third reason is absorption. The Mongols were a relatively small population governing enormous territories of much more numerous peoples. Within a few generations, the ruling class inevitably became more like the people they ruled and less like the steppe warriors who had created the empire. Kublai's court became Chinese, the Golden Horde became Islamic, the Ilkhanate became Islamic. The identity that had held the empire together, the sense of being Mongol, of belonging to the family of Genghis Khan, of owing loyalty to the great Khan, dissolved in the acids of cultural contact. The fourth reason is the plague. The Black Death reduced populations, disrupted economies, and created the kind of social chaos in which political structures collapse. The Khanates that were already struggling to maintain their authority were further weakened by the catastrophic mortality of the 1340s and 1350s. And the fifth reason, perhaps the most human of all, is simply this. The men who came after Genghis Khan were not Genghis Khan. He was a phenomenon, the kind of figure who appears perhaps once in a millennium, who combines military genius with political brilliance, with personal charisma, with a willingness to do whatever is necessary in quantities that simply cannot be transmitted to children and grandchildren. His sons and grandsons were capable men, some of them extraordinary men, but they were not him. They could not hold together by force of personality what he had created by force of personality. The empire was, in some sense, a one-man creation, and one-man creations do not survive their creators. Part 16. What remained? The Mongol Empire fell, but it left traces that are still visible today. The most lasting legacy is perhaps the most paradoxical. The Pax Mongolica, the century of relative peace and security on the Silk Road trade routes, facilitated an exchange of goods, ideas, technologies, and diseases between East and West that permanently changed both. Chinese technologies, gunpowder, printing, paper money spread westward through Mongol channels. Islamic mathematics and astronomy spread eastward. The Black Death spread in both directions. The modern borders of many countries in Central Asia and the Middle East were shaped by the Mongol conquests and their aftermath. Russia's historical relationship with Central Asia, the centuries of expansion that created the Russian Empire, was in part a response to and continuation of the Mongol legacy on the steppe. The Russian concept of Eurasia, the idea that Russia is fundamentally connected to Asia as well as Europe, has deep roots in the Mongol period, when Russia was part of a vast Eurasian political system centered in the East. In China, the Yuan period left traces in the administrative geography of the country. Some of the provincial boundaries that the Ming dynasty inherited from the Yuan have survived into the modern People's Republic of China. Mongolia itself, the country that exists today sandwiched between Russia and China, is the direct descendant of the Mongol Empire. Small, landlocked, sparsely populated, it carries the memory of the greatest land empire in history in its national identity and its national pride. Genghis Khan is still worshipped there, quite literally. There are temples dedicated to him. His face is on the currency. The international airport in Ulaanbaatar bears his name. The empire is gone, the conquerors are long dead. The cities they burned have been rebuilt, the populations they killed have been replaced. But the man who started it all is not forgotten. Closing the step 80 night. And so the story of the Mongol Empire's fall comes to rest. A century and a half, from the death of Genghis Khan on the Chinese frontier in 1227, through the reigns of sons and great-grandsons, through civil wars and religious conversions and the Black Death, to the final silence of the last Khanates in the 15th and 16th centuries. What does it mean? Perhaps this, that empires built on force alone cannot outlast the force that built them, that the qualities required to conquer the world are not the same as the qualities required to govern it, that the children of conquerors become something their parents could not have imagined, absorbed into the cultures they ruled, transformed by the civilisations they thought they were destroying. The Mongols conquered the world, and the world absorbed them. Not immediately, not painlessly, not without an ocean of suffering and death that staggers the imagination. But eventually, inexorably. The steppe wind still blows, the stars are still extraordinary above the grasslands of Mongolia, the horses still run. But the empire is the memory of a memory, a story told to children, embroidered by centuries, held in the name of an airport and the face on a coin. Let those images settle now, like dust on the open steppe. The great Kurultai on the banks of the Onon River, Ojday's armies turning back from the Adriatic, Kublai's court in Beijing half Chinese and half Mongol, the plague moving along the Silk Road, the Russian principalities watching the Mongol army withdraw across the Ugra. Let the names grow quiet: Genghis, Ojday, Tolui, Kublai, Huligu, Batu, Monk, Arak Bok, the sons and grandsons who inherited the world and lost it. There are no more Kurultais to attend tonight. No more Khans to elect, no more empires to hold together. Only the steppe wind and the stars and the long quiet dark. And sleep, soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.